The farmhouse smelled like burned coffee and old wood, and May Carter was thinking about neither of those things when the sky fell. She heard it first, a sound like a pressure seal rupturing across the whole dome of heaven. A shriek that rose and then collapsed in on itself, something enormous losing a fight with gravity. The coffee mug was still in her hand when she stepped onto the porch. To the north, past the tree line where the creek bent, an orange light was threading through the pines, and then there was an impact she felt in her teeth. Her husband Dale made it to the porch 3 seconds behind her. Her son Marcus, 12, was a half step behind him. They stood there, the three of them, looking at the smoke, rising in a slow dark column against the blue afternoon sky. And none of them said anything because there was nothing yet to say. "Plain?" Marcus said eventually. Dale shook his head. "Wrong sound." May set the mug down on the porch railing. She had spent 9 years as a field medic with the Colonial Defense Corps before the war ended. Before the treaty at Dinner's Station that nobody on either side was really satisfied with. She had a particular relationship with wrong sounds. Her body was already cataloging exits. "Get inside," she said, "both of you now." They didn't argue. That was the thing about the Carter household. They had all lived close enough to real danger that they recognized the register in May's voice when she wasn't being cautious anymore, when she was being certain. She watched the smoke for another few seconds. Then she followed them in and bolted the door. The first one came through the tree line 40 minutes later. May saw him from the kitchen window. He was tall, taller than any man she'd known, and he moved with his shoulders angled slightly forward in a way that read as pain or aggression or both. He wore a suit that she recognized from old intelligence briefings, Styrolean recon grade, flexible armor panels over a pressure weave designed for short extractions, not long campaigns. The suit was damaged. His left side was scorched from hip to shoulder, and he was compensating for it, listing slightly. But his eyes were moving fast across the tree line and the fields. Tactical. Alive. A second figure emerged behind him, younger. She guessed, though you could never really tell with Styroleans. Where the first moved like a predator, this one moved like a pilot, carefully, reading terrain as if it were instrumentation. He was supporting the other's weight at intervals. There was something between them that she'd seen between soldiers too. Obligation, maybe. Not friendship, something colder and more binding. She went to the gun cabinet. Dale was already there. 2 of them, she said. I counted. He handed her the shotgun and took the rifle for himself. Marcus was in the corner of the kitchen, back against the wall, watching his parents with wide eyes that were trying very hard not to be afraid. Attic, May told him. Stay flat. Don't come down for any sound except my voice, and only if I say the word spool. You remember spool, he nodded. She looked at him long enough to make it mean something, and then he went. The taller Styrolean, the damaged one, did not knock. He tested the door handle, found it locked, and put his shoal through the wood like it was paper. He came in fast and mean, sweeping the entryway, and May had the shotgun up and pointed at his chest before he'd fully cleared the frame. He stopped. His companion came in behind him, slower, hands visible. That was interesting. May filed it. The tall one's eyes tracked from the shotgun to her face and back. He made a sound, low, rasping, something between a word and a warning, and she didn't need a translator to read it. She'd heard that sound in a dozen languages over 9 years, and it always meant the same thing. I could take that from you. Yeah, she said. You could try. He understood the tone, if not the words. The angle of his shoulders changed. Not retreat. Assessment. He was deciding something. His companion spoke then. Styrolean, a full sentence, and the tall one answered with 2 clipped syllables that sounded like a door slamming. The companion, Caleb 7, May would learn later, a second-class tuba pilot assigned to a commander he clearly did not like, looked at May with something that might have been an apology. It was the most human expression she'd seen on an alien face in 9 years of fighting them. The tall one, Gropper. That was the name the companion had used in the wreckage report May would find later in the emergency broadcast system, moved through her house like he owned it. He checked every room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this on 100 other worlds, clearing corners, testing windows, cataloging. He killed her dog in the backyard with a hand weapon that left no mark, just stillness, and he did it without ceremony, the way you'd turn off a light. May heard the small particular silence that followed and had to stand very still for a moment against the wall, breathing through it. Gropper came back inside and spoke to his companion again. Caleb 7 sat down at May's kitchen table without being asked and looked at his own hands. Dale was in the living room, ostensibly at gunpoint. Gropper had taken the rifle, though not the shotgun yet. May had made him understand, through a series of very patient and deliberate movements, that the shotgun was staying in her hands. He seemed to find this amusing, which was a data point, she noted. She brought 2 glasses of water to the kitchen table, set one in front of Caleb 7. He stared at it for a moment, then he picked it up and drank. Small things. She sat down across from him and put the shotgun on the table between them, pointed at the wall. A negotiated distance. He looked at the gun and then at her. "Cal," he said, pressing a hand to his chest. "May," she said. He repeated it carefully. She had the feeling he was storing it somewhere important. Over the next hour, she learned what she could from context and gesture and the very occasional Styrolian word she recognized from wartime briefings. Gropper was the problem. Gropper had been the problem before the ship went down. She gathered this from the way Caleb carried himself around him, the micro-contractions of avoidance that were recognizable across any species that had ever had a bad commanding officer. Gropper had escalated something during a recon pass and gotten them shot out of the sky. Now he needed a communications device to contact a Styrolian recovery vessel, and he had decided that the farmhouse and its occupants were resources to be used until that happened. He had also decided that May was the one to negotiate with. She didn't know if this was tactical intelligence or instinct, but it was correct. She went to Dale in the living room while Gropper was occupied with the communications array he'd pulled from his suit, trying to boost its range. She crouched beside Dale's chair and spoke in a low, fast voice. "He's going to try to push a signal. If he reaches their fleet, we have maybe 6 hours before a recovery ship comes. And us, witnesses." She didn't elaborate. 9 years in the Corps had made her good at saying hard things efficiently. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need?" She had already been thinking about this. The Styrolian communications array operated on a tight beam frequency that she knew, because she had spent the better part of year 3 of the war learning how to disrupt those frequencies. The Corps had called it soft interference. What it required was a radio transmitter modified with a particular oscillating pattern, which she did not have, and a power source of significant output, which she might. She had a generator in the back barn. She had a shortwave radio in the study that was older than Marcus. She had 9 years of hard-learned technical knowledge that the Styrolians had never once thought to ask about when they decided to take a farmhouse instead of a communications outpost. Their first mistake, she thought, was assuming this was just a house. "I need time," she said. "Keep him in here. Talk to him even if he doesn't understand. Make noise." "About what?" "Anything. Crops. Weather. Your childhood. It doesn't matter. It's sound, not content." She moved back to the kitchen. Caleb 7 was still at the table. She sat down again. He looked at her with those dark, double-lidded eyes, and she wondered what 9 years of war looked like from where he was sitting. Whether he'd been fighting it too, or whether this had been his first deployment. Whether he had a family somewhere on Styrolia who were waiting for a recon pilot who was maybe never going to come home. She picked up the shortwave radio manual from the shelf behind her. She kept it there because it had been her mother's, and old things sometimes needed to be visible to feel real, and she set it on the table and opened it. She began to turn pages, slowly, visibly. Caleb 7 watched her hands. She tapped a particular diagram, a wiring schematic. She didn't say anything. She just left her finger on it and looked at him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he leaned forward and looked at the diagram and said something in Styrolian that she didn't know. but his voice had the careful, reluctant quality of someone making a decision they would not be able to take back. She waited. He reached into a pocket in his suit and set a small component on the table between them. An oscillator she recognized from the communications array from the device Gropper was working on in the other room. Small, probably missed. She looked at it. She looked at him. He looked at the diagram. She took the component. The next hour was the longest of her life. She moved through the house with the deliberate normality of someone who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in a volatile situation was act afraid. She offered Gropper water, which he refused. She offered food, which he also refused, though the refusal was more of a distracted grunt because he was fighting with the array. She brought Dale a cup of coffee and pressed his hand briefly in a way that meant, "I'm working on it." She got to the barn through the kitchen side door at a moment when Gropper was occupied, and Caleb 7 was watching the window with the abstracted focus of someone listening for something in the distance. She worked fast in the barn by feel and memory, because she didn't turn on a light. The generator, the shortwave. Her fingers found the housing for the oscillator port, and she slid the component in, and it fit, because Caleb 7 had given her the right one. She thought about that for a moment, crouched in the dark over a 40-year-old radio, an alien component in her hand, and she thought about the double-lidded eyes across her kitchen table and the water glass he'd accepted. Then she finished the work. The soft interference signal went out on the Styrolean recovery frequency at a low, sustained, corrupting frequency that would read to any incoming vessel as atmospheric interference over a wide grid. Not a jam. Jams could be compensated for. This was subtler, a signature mimicking ionospheric scatter that their navigation systems were known to trust over their own instruments in certain conditions. She had written a training brief on it in year 4 of the war. She had no idea if it was still current. She was betting that Styrolean military technology updated its threat matrices more slowly than human operators updated their field experience. She was betting her family's lives on the possibility that she knew more about their systems than they expected her to. She went back inside. Caleb 7 hadn't moved. Gropper was beginning to get frustrated. She could read it in the way he was moving. Shorter gestures, sharper angles, the controlled temper of someone who expected things to work and was encountering resistance. He spoke to Caleb 7 in a clipped burst, and Caleb answered briefly, and Gropper made a sound that she had heard enough alien officers make to identify it universally. "This is someone else's fault." He came into the kitchen. He was bigger up close than he'd seemed coming through the tree line, and the damaged side of his suit still smelled of the scorched material from the crash, acrid and chemical. He stood in her kitchen and looked at her with those eyes that had no particular quality she could read. Not cruelty, not calculation, just a kind of absolute self-reference, the gaze of something that categorized everything it saw as either useful or not. And he spoke. She didn't understand the words. She understood the intent. "I know. It's not working. I'm sorry about that." He watched her. "Signal's going to keep breaking up," she continued. She kept her voice level. Conversational. She had learned during the war that tone traveled even when language didn't. "It's an ionospheric thing. We get it out here. The valley does something to signals. We never could figure out what. That's why we kept the shortwave." Gropper stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb 7. Caleb 7 said something short. Gropper answered. Caleb 7 looked at May, and for a moment she couldn't tell if he was going to warn her, or help her, or simply say nothing. He had given her the component. He had watched her leave for the barn and had not called out. She didn't know if that was deliberate or inattentive or something else altogether, some Styrolean calculus she wasn't equipped to interpret. He looked back at Gropper and said something that sounded, in its rhythms, like confirmation, like the reasonable explanation being accepted. Gropper moved away from her, back to the array, still frustrated, but working with it now instead of adjusting rather than pushing. May sat down at her own table in her own kitchen, and she breathed. It held for 2 more hours. She made dinner. She made dinner because it was the most normal and disarming thing she could think of, because the smell of food cooking had a specific effect on biological creatures across a surprisingly wide range of species. She had learned this during the war from a xenobiologist who'd spent most of the armistice negotiations eating VAD sandwiches in a corridor, and because she needed to keep her hands occupied while she thought. Marcus came down from the attic once, around hour 3, because he'd heard something, and his 12-year-old nerve had finally frayed past the point of stillness. He came through the hallway door and stopped when he saw Gropper. And Gropper looked at him with that categorizing gaze, and May was across the kitchen in 4 steps and between them before she'd consciously decided to move. "My son," she said, flat, declarative, in the tone she'd used during the war when she needed something to be understood without translation. Gropper looked at her. Something in the geometry of his posture shifted, not softening, she would never have called it that, but a slight repositioning of the calculation. File under, she will complicate things if this gets worse. File under, not worth it yet. He looked away. May put her hand on the back of Marcus's neck and steered him toward the table. "Sit down," she said quietly. "Eat, stay quiet." And then, very low, "You're okay," he nodded. He sat. He was shaking slightly, the way you shook when the adrenaline had nowhere to go and nothing to do. And she recognized that too from the Corps, from the young medics on their first real deployment who hadn't yet learned where to put the fear. And she recognized that she had put it somewhere she didn't want to examine too closely. Caleb 7 looked at Marcus. He looked at May. He said something under his breath that she thought might have been a question. She met his eyes. "Yeah," she said, even though she hadn't understood. He nodded. Slowly, the recovery vessel hours late, which was not, as Gropper furiously communicated over the finally restored signal, within acceptable parameters. May stood on her porch and watched the lights of it over the tree line. Running silent, a dark shape against the stars, and she thought about the component she'd removed from the barn generator and put back in Caleb 7's hand 2 hours ago, and the way he'd looked at it and at her, and had said something that she would spend a long time trying to find a translation for. The handoff at the perimeter was fast and impersonal, the way military handoffs always were. Gropper went through it, like he'd forgotten. The farmhouse existed, the moment he had somewhere better to be. May watched him go without expression. Caleb 7 paused at the tree line. He turned back. She was standing on the porch steps, Marcus beside her, Dale's hand at her shoulder, and Caleb 7 looked at the 3 of them in the blue pre-dawn light, and she thought about what they must look like to him. 3 humans at the edge of a farmhouse, at the edge of a field, at the edge of a war that was technically over. Witnesses to something. He brought his hand up, not a weapon gesture, not a salute in any configuration she recognized, something else. Something that looked in the way all true gestures look regardless of the species making them, like, "I see you." She raised her hand back. He went into the trees. The dark shape over the pines rose without sound and moved west and was gone. May sat down on the porch step. She was suddenly very tired. The kind of tired that lives under adrenaline and only comes out when the thing you were afraid of has finally passed. When the body understands, it's allowed to stop holding. Marcus sat beside her. Dale leaned against the railing. "You want to tell me how you knew the signal thing would work?" Dale said. "I didn't," she said. "I knew it had a chance of working." "That's a distinction." "Yes, it is." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Then the young one, he helped you, didn't he?" She looked at him. Sometimes she forgot how much he watched and understood. "He gave me a part I needed," she said. "Why?" She thought about double-lidded eyes. She thought about a glass of water accepted across a table in the middle of a war. She thought about the way obligation, and something slightly warmer than obligation, sometimes lived in the same gesture, in the same species, in the same body, and how you couldn't always tell from the outside which one it was, and how sometimes that didn't matter. "I don't know," she said. Maybe he was tired of following orders from someone he didn't respect. Maybe he figured we weren't worth the cost. Maybe something else. Maybe he just didn't want anybody else to die, Marcus said. She put her arm around her son. The sky was going grey at the edges, the slow, uncertain light of morning, finding its way back into the world the way it always did, without asking permission, without announcing itself, just arriving. Maybe, she said. The official report, filed 3 weeks later with the Colonial Defense Corps, because old habits and old obligations had long arms, listed the incident as a minor incursion, 2 Styrolean survivors of a downed recon vessel, contained without casualties. It listed May Carter, formerly Sergeant First Class, as the primary responder. It listed the method of containment as soft interference, ionospheric class, self-constructed. There was a note from the reviewing officer that said simply, "Outstanding." She read it once, folded it, and put it in the same drawer as her mother's radio manual. The war was over. The treaty was unsatisfying. The nights were quiet now, mostly in the way that things are quiet when they are resting rather than finished. She poured a cup of coffee that wasn't burned this time, and stood on the porch and watched the morning arrive, and thought about all the things that got across a table between 2 people, or 2 speak, when language ran out and something else had to do the work. Trust wasn't the right word. She'd thought about it often since. Trust implied more certainty than she had about what Caleb 7 had intended when he set that component on her kitchen table. But survival, she thought. Survival as a gesture offered between 2 intelligent creatures in a house that was too small for the war it had contained. That was close. That was maybe accurate enough. She drank the coffee. The sky was clear. The kind of clear that comes after things have burned and cooled and settled. The kind that looks like nothing happened and holds the proof of everything in its vast, indifferent blue. Somewhere out there, she supposed, a second-class tuba pilot was filing his own report. She wondered what it said. She hoped he'd gotten home.